Hello, class. Great to see you all again. I guess I'm not really seeing you, but I'm glad you're seeing me. How's that? Welcome to week 5. Yes. And in week 5 of our class, we are studying the 19th century still. So last week in week 4, we studied literature of the 19th century. And this week we are continuing that study of literature of the 19th century because with each century we have more and more literature put out by women writers as uh, the education of women and the rights of women continue to expand, and their access to writing utensils and materials, and also access to publication of their writings. So as those things continue to expand over the centuries as we progress towards the future, we also have more writings by women accordingly. That just makes sense, doesn't it? Yes. So anyway, we have more writings to cover in the 19th century, and therefore we need 2 weeks to cover this material. So I'm not going to repeat last week's overview of literature of the 19th century. If you would like to watch that again, just go back to week 4, click on that video lecture segment and go for it. Watch it again if you'd like context for the literature, to hear it and review it as you're studying this week's authors. So without further ado, I will proceed to our first author this week. Very exciting. Sojourner Truth. Yes, she is quite a rousing writer and an incredible female. The piece of hers that we read this week is entitled Ain't I a Woman? And it's actually a speech that she delivered numerous times. So this is a copy of her speech that we are reading. All right, if you look at the written lecture, I have a lovely actual photograph of Phyllis Wheatley herself. It's kind of neat as we're in this modern era. We're able to see photographs of these women. I mean, it's not the modern era, but as a more modern era, I should say. So yeah, we have the benefit of seeing what these female authors really looked like, these women authors, yes. So we do have a photo of Sojourner Truth, so go to the written lecture to see that. And then the written lecture also contains a couple different really neat web links if you'd like to check those out. There is, for example, the sojournertruth.org website with lots of biographical and literary information on Sojourner Truth. There is a PBS website that has biographical information on Sojourner Truth. And then what is really, really fun is we actually have 3 different readings of Sojourner Truth's speech by three different women. So if you would like to hear her speech, which is really how Sojourner Truth herself delivered it, so really it's meant to be heard, kind of like when you talk about plays are meant to be watched, right? And often people will say about poetry is meant to be read aloud. Well, so too is a speech meant to be read aloud and listened to, right? Because that it's got all the different oral devices, right, to make it appealing to be heard. All right, so one YouTube link is a version of Sojourner Truth's speech, Ain't I a Woman, read by Kerry Washington. You may know her as an actress. She gives a very rousing delivery. Another version of the speech on YouTube that I've included the link for is performed, I should say, by Alfre Woodard, another actress, and she does it very powerfully. And a third version of her speech on YouTube is actually read by Alice Walker, who wrote In Search of Our Mother's Gardens that we read the first week of class. So it's really neat to hear one of our authors that we've already read an author from this week. So they're all like 3 different takes on the very same speech. So it's interesting to see how you can read the same speech 3 different ways, right? Because each woman gives the speech her own spin. As probably, I'm sure, Sojourner Truth did herself. Now, we don't have a recording of Sojourner Truth's speech, but it's neat to be able to hear three different versions, three different takes on that same speech, and imagine how Sojourner Truth would have delivered that speech herself. All right. Well, one thing for sure is Sojourner Truth would have done it a little differently because she actually spoke Dutch as her native tongue. So her English would have been accented by a Dutch way of speaking. So some sort of Dutch accent that dovetailed with how one would pronounce Dutch. Although then, of course, Sojourner Truth learned English. So she learned English, but accented with a little bit of that native Dutch spin to it. Now, Sojourner Truth, of course, lived in the United States of America. She was born in 1797 and lived till 1883, so till about 86 years old. I believe she is actually the oldest of our writers, or she may be. I'd have to go back and look at the ones from week 1. She for sure is the oldest of our writers in history that we studied so far. So that's pretty neat that she had such a long life. She was born in New York, and as I mentioned before, she spoke Dutch as her native tongue. Interestingly, the New York had been settled originally by Dutch settlers, so there was still some Dutch going on there in the state of New York. She learned English induced by beatings after being sold away as a 9-year-old from her family, very sadly. Originally named Isabella Baumfree, she later took the name of Isabella van Wagenen after the family who protected her when she, after years of abuse, sellings, and having even her children sold away from her, she actually was able to escape to freedom with her infant daughter, Sophia, in 1827. In 1828, Sojourner filed a lawsuit against an Alabama enslaver who illegally bought her son, Peter, from her former enslaver in New York, where enslaved people had finally become emancipated. So in New York, slaves had been emancipated in 1828. Okay, that's well before the Civil War. But that's the North, right? And so the North freed slaves well before the South ever did, unfortunately. But anyway, because her son was living in New York, he was supposed to be freed, but instead, the man who had enslaved him in New York, instead of freeing him, he illegally sold him to an enslaver who was living in Alabama. And in Alabama, the slaves were not free yet. So when he got sold down to Alabama, Peter, that meant he was still enslaved there. But that was illegal for that owner to sell him because he should have been freed at that point. So Sojourner sued the Alabama enslaver who had illegally bought her son Peter from her former enslaver in New York. Well, can you believe that? A black woman in America who had escaped to freedom a year before she actually would have been freed in her native state of New York. She ran off, escaped, and then turned around and sued the man who illegally bought her son, who should have been freed that next year. And guess what happened? Sojourner Truth became the first black woman to win a lawsuit against a white man in America, and she had her first son, Peter, returned to her. Later, she actually won another lawsuit against a white couple who had slandered her by saying that she had poisoned them. So pretty neat that she won 2 lawsuits. First black woman ever to do that in America. and against white people there. So pretty amazing turnaround for the rights that um, Black people had encountered, or African American people had encountered thus far in America. That is. So after she was free, she felt as if the Spirit called her to be a preacher. So she changed her name to Sojourner Truth to represent her life as a sojourner or traveler. So to be a sojourner means to be a traveler. To sojourn somewhere means to travel somewhere. Who would proclaim the truth to people. So that's why she named herself Sojourner Truth. She was a traveler who preached truth. As she did in her famed speech that we read for class, Ain't I a Woman? She was published in 1851. She delivered that speech in her Dutch accented English at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. That's why it was entitled Ain't I a Woman? Because Sojourner Truth was a woman, and she was a freed woman at that, yet she did not experience the treatment that other women did in America. And that's what she's questioning in that speech. And that speech became a very famous speech, and she delivered it at other places, but first in that women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio. So she was associated with a great group of women at this point. Although Sojourner was illiterate all her life, that means she never learned how to read or write, she dictated her life story to Olive Gilbert, who published it as The Narrative of Sojourner Truth in 1850. And she also dictated her speech. So this speech was transcribed by someone else. Kind of like Marjorie Kemp did, right? When she was also illiterate, yet she was able to transcribe her life story to someone else who wrote it down and then published it. Sojourner Truth lived in communes, helped prostitutes, campaigned for the rights of enslaved people, African Americans, blacks, and women. Pretty neat. She met with President Abraham Lincoln and worked with abolitionists. So those are people who wanted to get rid of slavery, like William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass. You may have heard of Frederick Douglass. He was a very, very famous freed African American, formerly enslaved person. And she encouraged freed African Americans to move to the new frontier of the West. So the West was the western portion of the United States that had not been basically set up as states yet, because they didn't have rights. I mean, not rights. They didn't have laws that would force people into slavery. So she encouraged them to move there where people were still free and rights were not codified yet. She lived a full and amazing life, especially given her inhospitable beginnings, her inhumane beginnings as an enslaved person, and the trauma she went through there. So I am pleased to give you the life story of Sojourner Truth and the reading of hers that we study for class. Ain't I a Woman? Enjoy these powerful writings, Sojourner Truth.